Ladies and gentlemen, this week in the video, we're going to be talking about the GTX 1070 yet again. 24 hours after my previous video, yet more information has emerged concerning Nvidia's up-and-coming card. Now, this information does give us a hint of what the card's going to be able to achieve when it's placed inside your machine, and clears up some of the previous ambiguity that we had regarding the specifications and some of the functionality of the GPU. Let's face it, the GTX 1070 is probably the card a lot of folks are going to opt for. Not only is it at a reasonable price point, but it also offers enough performance to be able to justify running a 1080p display, a 1440p display, and for those who are considering potentially SLI in the near future, you should easily be able to run, let's say, a 4K display or virtual reality without too much difficulty whatsoever. Now, just to reiterate the specifications that we had yesterday, there will of course be 1920 CUDA cores running at 1506 MHz for the base clock, with an accelerated boost clock of 1683. That's with a memory speed of 8 gigabits per second, and that is naturally with 8 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory, which is obviously significantly slower than the GDDR5X, but as we also discussed just yesterday, how much of a difference that makes when you factor in the further color compression of Pascal remains to be seen. This means that we have a memory bandwidth of 256 gigabytes per second, which isn't too shabby, and easily bests the 224 possessed by the GTX 980. Overall though, the big questions really fall down to performance, and Nvidia have decided to at least share some measure of how the GPU is going to perform. Now, supposedly we're going to be looking at about a 1.75 times the performance, or a 1.5-ish times the performance relative to the GTX 970, which isn't too shabby. It's roughly in the same ballpark, of course, as the 1080 was to the 980 in theoretical terms. The real boon comes from virtual reality, where obviously there's quite a significant lead, up to about 2.5 times the base machine. Now, before I jump back onto the topic of ROPs and TMUs, because some information has emerged concerning those, but we'll get into that in just a second, I do want to point out that Nvidia should be on track to match their claims, which were made back in May the 6th of this year by the Nvidia's founder, Zhen Songhuang, and he declared that both the 1080 and 1070 should be able to outperform the Titan X. If this is accurate, then yeah, it should theoretically be able to beat, or at least to match, the 980 Ti or the Titan X in a lot of titles. Now, there is also a small white lie, but I say white lie in the nicest possible way, because the FP32 performance, which you can easily calculate yourself by simply taking the number of CUDA cores and the base clock, and then just doing some simple mathematics, you can start noticing that if you take the base clock into account, the GPU only actually offers 5.8 teraflops of performance. It's not until you factor in the boost clocks where it starts to go to about the 6.5, which Nvidia are the ones who are obviously, or rather the figure that Nvidia themselves are touting. So, here's where things start to get a little more complex. So, there has been some random comments regarding the number of ROPs inside the machine. So, the way I heard it initially, that early reports from leaks had the GPU, this is back several weeks ago, the GPU had 48 ROPs and 120 TMUs. And then, of course, we got a whole bevy of information concerning the fact that the GPU may not have full bandwidth available for the 8 gigabytes, but that the bandwidth part seems to not be the case. Now, Nvidia have then recently gone and done a record, that makes more sense, doesn't it? And they have said, and this is from a German website if memory serves, they have said that the GTX 1070 has a full memory subsystem. So theoretically this means that the GPU has full whole level 2 cache, which was another thing missing from the 970, and theoretically speaking it has all of the ROPs available from the 1080, so that would mean that we have 60 ROPs available for the GTX for the 1070, which would be kind of awesome. But aside from that, Nvidia haven't actually gone on record and told us what there is, and furthermore, which is really confusing, white papers have not emerged, so it's a lot of hearsay at the moment. So I wanted to update you all. So it looks like the GPU is either going to have 48 ROPs or it's going to have all of the ROPs. So that's about as clear as, oh, I don't know, a concrete wall. Furthermore, and to add to the confusions, because I'm pretty sure that we need more confusions, right? So the GTX 1070, as I mentioned at the very start of this video, will support SLI, but it does require special high bandwidth bridge to do this. Now, Nvidia have started to move away a little bit from 3-way and 4-way SLI. This was especially the case back several years ago where Nvidia were really pushing this, but since then I guess they haven't really done that, and this is probably because of the emergence of really high-end expensive cards and the fact that, to be honest with you, the market for them is really small, and because GPUs with the PCIe 3 and other components start to really eat into the bandwidth of the systems anyway, you start getting this law of diminishing returns. And honestly, Crossfire and SLI, once you go to above 2 cards, it starts to get really iffy. Now, from what we've heard, there isn't really any confirmation officially whether you're going to be able to run more than 2 1070s in SLI. So 2 will definitely work, which is great, but if you want more than that, it's not confirmed, and all we're hearing is that there are going to be additional steps. But what those additional steps are going to be, whether you have to make a sacrifice of your firstborn, we just don't know, which is kind of crappy, to be honest. So yeah, I just wanted to clear this up because yesterday's video, obviously, there were a few things that, quite frankly, more stuff has emerged, which it doesn't necessarily prove that I have a video wrong, but it's also another food for thought. And that's the issue, unfortunately, with reporting news early. My honest opinion of the GTX 1070, given this latest news, it's pretty much the same. I mean, the number of ROPs is great and all, but let's face it, assuming Nvidia's performance boasts are semi-accurate, let's say it offers, let's even say 980 Ti-ish performance, or maybe slightly more, for the price point, that's a lot of performance, it really is. And for folks who are not going with full 4K displays, my presumption is that if you can afford a 4K monitor that's a decent 4K monitor, presumably you could afford a 1080. I know that's not always the case. Maybe, you know, you had a more higher paying job then, or maybe you've just gotten a mortgage or whatever, but generally most folks are going to afford a decent high-end 4K monitor. They can afford a 1080. So those folks are sorted. For those who own a 1440p or below monitor, and there are still a lot of people who do play at 1080p. For example, let's say you own a nice 1080p television. It's really tempting to just plug that sucker in and then, well, game at like a 50-inch screen. And it's very difficult to blame you, in which case the 1070 is going to be an absolute screamer of a card. And for those who are considering jumping early into virtual reality, it's also going to be pretty darn tempting as well. As my previous video concluded though, I would highly consider opting for the waiting game. I would personally wait for Polaris, because Polaris is looking really powerful. In terms of raw T-flop performance, potentially it's faster than the 1070 and may be able to compete with the 1080, but it really depends on how many compute units, and we've heard between 32, 36 and 40 compute units. My guess is it's going to be at least 36 because of the PS4K, which is going to be using 36, so it would be pretty astounding if AMD didn't at least match that number of CUs. Theoretically, AMD should be able to compete at least in raw T-flops, and while T-flops don't necessarily equate to performance, you're going to feel pretty sick if you upgrade and then a couple of weeks later someone else releases a card that's faster. Normally I don't advocate waiting if the wait is like 3 months, because you could theoretically be waiting forever. But when cards are basically emerging within the same timescale, and I say this from my personal standpoint, and I say this from someone who bought a CPU before and then a couple of weeks later a better CPU was released, basically an updated architecture. I've done that before because I decided to ignore the fact that AMD were going to release the Athlon 64s way back when. No one thought there was going to be that much of a performance jump. I bought into the older architecture and I was pissed. And I've also made the mistake on buying a Nvidia card. I don't remember the GPU, if I'm totally honest. And AMD released... no, actually, I think it was ATI back then, released a card that was faster. I want to say it was the 9800 Pro, and I sheepishly... or it might be the 9700. And I sheepishly had to do an upgrade anyway, because there was so much of a difference, and I was pretty pissed about that as well. So since then, whenever cards are releasing roughly within the same time frame, I've always said to myself, no, that's a bad pull, you're gonna wait. And I've always been a lot happier. But obviously, at the end of the day, your money, you make the decision. And even if, and I've said this a couple of times over, even if the Polaris architecture is 10% faster, 15% faster than the GTX 1070, you're probably not going to be exactly upset buying a GTX 1070. Let's just be honest. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.